This week, CU Buffs running back Charlie Offerdahl announced that he is retiring because of repeated concussions. He told the team his decision, saying that he will miss the game, but he's in the process of applying to dental school. Coach Prime shared a video of the moment saying that we love you, and Prime told him his scholarship will be honored for his senior year. In the video, Offerdahl also told his team that his last concussion was really scary to him and his family.
What a tough decision to make,
Yeah.
you know? So this morning, 9 News medical expert Dr. Payal Kohli joins us to talk more about concussions and CTE. Thanks for coming in.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So Offerdahl retired due to repeated concussions. Can you actually predict the risk of someone getting CTE?
You know, CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, is something that's usually diagnosed at death. You have to cut open the brain tissue and look under the microscope, but we're learning that there are indirect ways of sort of predicting who might end up being at risk. And it's really the number of head traumas that you've had, because it's the way the brain responds to injury. It heals it by putting down this protein called tau protein, almost like a scar tissue in the brain. And where it puts it down, that's what causes the symptoms. So you look at the number of concussions, you look at how many years they've played, you also look at the subconcussive impacts. So how many times they've hit their head when they haven't had a concussion. And then you can do genetic testing as well to see if somebody has an ApoE4 gene. That's the same gene that causes Alzheimer's, that makes their brain more sensitive to an injury pattern. And putting all that together really helps to predict the risk. In his case, I think if he's had multiple concussions, he had this really scary one, I wholeheartedly support this decision, because I think we've seen that young people can get CTE.
And that kind of leads into our next question. There is some new data from Boston University that young players can get CTE. What did this study find, and how does it relate to his decision as well?
So this was really scary. They looked at 150 people under the age of 30 who died for other reasons, and then examined their brains, and these were all people who had played contact sports. Over 40% had CTE. Now, most of those were mild cases, but there were a few that actually had stage 3 or stage 4 CTE under the age of 30. And we're talking mostly amateur athletes. We're not talking about pro players either. So this really raises the question about what we're doing with our high school and college athletes as well. Are we monitoring close enough for head traumas and really being proactive in terms of predicting their risk?
I mean, obviously, we were talking about college a second ago, but you brought up high school. I think back to this shooter in New York, and he talked about how he thought he had CTE from playing football when he was in high school. Because a part of this conversation, too, is the head trauma when you're at such a young age, when the brain is developing.
Right? That's exactly right. It doesn't heal itself in the same way, and it can cause progressive symptoms. Even though you may have had the trauma when you were younger, it can manifest itself much later. And there's no treatment, as you know, and it's a progressive condition. And it impacts our impulse control centers, our memory centers, and our behavioral centers. It even impacts our fear centers. So you can see this kind of irrational behavior where people are acting out, or more violent impulses and such, in people who have CTE.
So if you've had head trauma and repeated concussions, is there any way to reduce your risk of developing CTE?
You know, you can't change the head trauma and the injury to the head trauma, but what you can do is stop playing. Okay. That's one of the biggest recommendations for people who may be at high risk for CTE. They also say that you can stop avoiding other things. You can, avoid other things like alcohol or anything else that might affect how the brain kind of heals itself. And then you have to be really careful about your cardiac health, because that's one of the other things that causes brain injury: high cholesterol, high blood pressure, blood sugar, what have you. So we really focus intensely on these patients' cardiac health as well.
What kind of monitoring will Offerdahl need kind of going forward now to just kind of see his progress?
I would watch him really closely. So I would have him see a neurologist once a year. I would have him do some kind of a memory and mood testing every 6 to 12 months. And then usually they say for people at high risk for CTE, neuropsychological testing, formal testing to actually look for some of these symptoms every 1 to 2 years. Now we're working on MRIs and blood tests and even things in the spinal fluid, markers in the spinal fluid that can predict CTE risk, because you start to put down that tau protein long before you start to have many of the changes. But these are all much more experimental. Right now, we don't have an MRI that can tell us if somebody's having CTE, but certainly watching him very closely, having him do that testing, I think it's going to be really important.
CTE is really top of mind right now. It's been talked about a lot this week, not only with this story, but of course the New York, what I was mentioning. That shooter really wanted to be tested for CTE. It's why he shot himself in the chest, so that his brain could be looked at. Because you talked about this, the only way to really diagnose it is after someone dies.
Right, it's an autopsy, and it's looking at it under the microscope, and then you can see the extent of it. Now, there's some emerging data that the way we sleep can actually heal CTE.
Really?
Wow.
Yeah, and so deep sleep can actually help to heal some of that tau protein that accumulates in the brain. So they're looking at whether sleep therapy in some of these athletes can be helpful as well. I do think we need to start tracking head traumas, and just like when, as a doctor, I go into the cath lab where there's radiation, I have to wear a little Geiger counter that tracks my radiation exposure. We should have helmets that track how many times you've had head injuries, because some of them could just not feel like a big injury, but still be increasing your risk. And if you've crossed a certain threshold, I do think it's time to pull you out of sports at that point.
Yeah, certainly a lot, very interesting conversation. Like you said, top of mind for a lot of folks right now. Dr. Kohli, we appreciate you breaking it down. Thank you so much.